Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Tanner F. Boyle. He published a fascinating book back in 2020. The title of the book is The Fortean Influence on Science Fiction, Charles Fort and the Evolution of the Genre. So I'm delighted to have him on the show because this is a person who I think is very important, who passed away, I think, in the 30s, but his influence is really immense on the modern culture. And some of these people that you see on big podcasts or shows, or even on kind of paranormal radio, I think you can trace a line back to Charles Fort. But Tanner traces the line of Charles Fort's influence through science fiction, or SF. You can shorten that to an acronym, SF, through a lot of characters that I have, or individuals that I have researched independently. Arthur C. Clarke, Robert Anton Wilson. I did a show about Robert Heinlein, Stranger in a Strange Land. And so there's a lot of really interesting characters in this book. And the primary character is a guy by the name of Charles Boyle Fort. But Tanner can talk more about that. So Tanner F. Boyle, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
Excellent. So for people who may not have heard your name or this book, can you kind of talk about your background, what led you to put together this material and then publish this title, The Fortean Influence on Science Fiction?
So yeah, I was a English major in college, and this book actually comes out of a undergraduate thesis, and I just sort of expanded on it, turned it into a book. My background's in like cultural studies, things like that. I was very grateful that my advisors allowed me to tackle science fiction and Charles Fort, because I would say that's highly unusual. He's not really a known name in the English world, but yeah, I've been into Fort and the paranormal since I was just a kid. I think I was introduced to Fort's name in a young adult novel I mention in the book, Chasing Vermeer. He's used as like a somewhat recurring plot device, his book Low. And from there, bought the books, been going through them pretty much ever since. And yeah, I wasn't really a science fiction fan until later on, but after taking a few courses in it, I realized, like Charles Fort wrote about all of this stuff. And digging a little further, you can see that influence is often just named directly. They'll name Forts. They'll be interested in Fortean phenomena, other connections to his work. So, yeah.
And so, who was Charles Boyle Fort, and what were his books, and why is he an important kind of foundation for your book?
So he was something of like a failed novelist, short story writer. His short stories were published because he had a good friend in Theodore Dreiser, the author of like Carrie and several like pretty important works in American literature in the early 1900s. And Fort eventually moved away from fiction, or kind of. Some people consider the stuff he wound up with still fiction. But he published the Book of the Damned in, I think, 1919. I'm hoping I'm not getting that wrong, but published 4 books focused on like unusual phenomena reported in newspapers or scientific journals, and sort of makes the case that our understanding of the world isn't quite what the scientists of the time would consider it to be. He wanted to make clear that things weren't as like set in stone, and there was possibly something fantastic going on in the background. The main phenomena associated with him are things falling from the sky. So like, if you could put together a list of that, it'd be very long. It'd be like pebbles, frogs, rain. I said rain, right. But blood.
Fish, right? All kinds of stuff, right?
Yeah. It's kind of amazing how much just junk is falling from the sky. But Yeah, he wrote 4 books. The first was The Book of the Damned, then New Lands, then Low, and Wild Talents was his last book. And he sort of covers just like the full spectrum of what would become like classic paranormal topics. There's even like early UFO stuff, spontaneous human combustion, mysterious disappearances, psychic powers, just like you name it, and it's in there.
Right. So he was like amassing all of these stories, all of these strange stories from newspapers, and really was kind of an encyclopedia of those stories, right? His book.
Yeah. He'd write things down on little note cards and stuff them in like a big drawer desk he had. And I think those are all like lost in a fire, which makes me sad, because those would be fascinating to see. He spent a lot of time in the New York Public Library just going through their collections. Spent some time in London doing the same thing, just like scanning countless volumes of newspapers and scientific journals, just looking for something anomalous. And when you put them all together like he did, it does paint a picture of the world that is like radically different from like the common understanding.
Right. So he is not the harsh, the cold, objective scientist, right? So he's kind of he's willing to look at this unexplained phenomenon, right? Categorize it.
Yeah, and he had a bit of a reputation as like a religious crank. I know there's some quote of his where he says like, "I can't believe that they're criticizing me for going after science this much. It's not as if I'm trying to bring back Moses," I think is the quote. So he really wasn't like, I think he was mostly uninterested in any kind of dogma and the effect that it could have on like our perceptions of like events and our understanding of the world. He felt like dogmas could paint a unmovable picture that wasn't always the true thing.
Right. So he's going against like the standard kind of milk toast grain. He included urban legends, I think, is an important part of the whole Fort influence too, leading up to today through the science fiction. But so many of these people are super influential. But he also influenced kind of the early pulp fiction, amazing stories, these kind of things where a lot of science fiction writers were publishing their work, right?
Yes. So John W. Campbell, the astounding science fiction editor, reviewed Fort's books pretty early on, and he noted them as like an excellent source book for sci-fi authors for ideas. And then later on, Amazing Stories, separate magazine, just to kind of show like how it was in like almost every pulp science fiction novel of the time. There's Fortean tracks throughout. Amazing Stories would republish Low as a serialized feature in the 30s.
Low was one of his books, right? Lo,
Yeah.
exclamation mark, right? That's the title.
Yeah, it always feels weird to say that.
Yeah, it does. Because you think LO, in my mind, I'm thinking LOW, but it's like lo and behold almost.
Yeah. But yeah, and I think the influence can become apparent when you realize just like how many science fiction authors of like the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s were reading these pulp science fiction magazines while Fort was being reprinted, while he was being suggested as an excellent source book. And I think that's largely where a lot of the influence comes from. But even like H.P. Lovecraft was aware of Fort contemporary to his time, and mentions Fort in a few fragments. His whole style is kind of like Fort's, where he's writing as if he's trying to pull a incredible hoax, I think is how he describes it at times. But and I
But it's
yeah
also that feel that the world is much different. It's a much different universe than this kind of sterile world, right? Isn't that kind of H.P. Lovecraft's? Is there something behind, something sinister behind behind our reality?
yeah, and I think Lovecraft also is critical of like an over reliance on science as a means to understanding the world better. Because usually these scientific endeavors backfire horribly.
Right. Sounds very current. Also, like I think Hubbard was publishing in Amazing Stories. You meant you have a whole section on Heinlein, right?
Yeah,
So these guys are all in that post after Fort passes away. They're right there in that very influential time, this foundational time of this uh, genre that didn't have a lot of respect right at that time. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. I find it interesting too that Campbell was influential in promoting Fort to sci-fi writers, and he's also the editor that put Dianetics in a sci-fi magazine for the first time. In fact, I'm struggling to remember the source on this, so I apologize, but I believe a um, there's another Hubbard connection in that his novel, I think Excalibur, was described as something that would make its readers faint, which was how the Book of the Damned was also advertised. Um, so kind of an interesting thing.
Right. So these are like they're like the modern ghost stories or something, the Fortean stories to have an effect upon you. Also, that was kind of like the one of your earlier kind of explanation. Can you explain kind of maybe the kind of maybe fiction? Like these writers are intentionally rubbing out the edges between fiction and nonfiction. Is that right?
Yeah, so Fort uses the term truth fiction, which I find has the like there's not enough like that feels too much like a binary, whereas I think it's more of a spectrum. So I did maybe fiction, but Fort's truth fiction is like the idea that there is something true in everyone's yarn, uh, specifically talking on urban legends. And I think that's something it's something that's existed in fiction for a long time, like like pretending that the writing is like a true tale as a means of like narrative. I'm losing my train of thought.
That's right. Well,
But
it's
like
just the fact that this
that's
this
existed since
blurring of
Robinson
meaning,
Crusoe.
right?
Yeah, yeah. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Robinson Crusoe, you use that as an example in the book of this kind of fictional truth telling, and that ties into Lovecraft too, right? Because he was supposedly leading people on. This is a true story about my adventure, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I think there's a sense in fiction in general that that's like an excellent way to like suspend the disbelief of the reader. And I
Right.
think Fort was influential in that way because he's reporting things that supposedly actually happened. So if you can take like these real world examples that sound fantastic, and you can source them back to Fort, like that makes the story sound pretty realistic.
Right, and you trace that kind of style through Blair Witch Project, one of those hugely influential films, the Montauk Project, Mothman Prophecies. So these are all 14 stories, modern 14 stories, right?
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for how influential Fort was on like that whole movement of like paranormal journalism, like trying to expand the boundaries of science. I also have a section where I kind of talk about how many of these like later Fortean authors were also interested in science fiction, like Keel had a sci-fi newsletter. Valet has written a few science fiction novels. There's a real overlap there. They're constantly talking with one another, even though they kind of remain separate.
It is interesting. And now you mentioned that for Whitley Strieber, right? Communion is supposedly, it was placed in the fiction section, but he portrays it as nonfiction, even though he wrote other kind of fictional books, right? So he's crossing different lines here.
This kind of comes to Kripal in that he notes that the themes of communion exist in his novels written beforehand. So I think there's some sense that it's like an interesting case of, well, was that the experience influencing his fiction subconsciously, or is his fiction influencing how his experience is perceived, that kind of thing.
Right.
And I don't think there's ever a super clear answer.
Right, it's fuzzy. Like, I think they intentionally like fuzzed out those borders, like those mental borders and terms. And you also play off the term maybe fiction with high weirdness from Eric Davis. Those kind of overlap too. So even Forteanism or Fortean influenced science fiction, there's a lot of high weirdness in that, right?
Oh yeah. I think the best example, if anyone's interested in picking up some pulp fiction, is Eric Frank Russell's Sinister Barrier, because it uses, like, I've tried to track down all of the sources of like the Fortean claims in it. It'll use like some real newspaper things to support the fictional plots, but it also invent a few. Just very interesting. It's like explicitly inspired by Fort, and sort of bouncing off of his claim that we might be property of something else that's dropping things on us from time to time.
Right. So he's actually kind of, that's the theme that goes through a lot of these science fiction and Strieber, right? Is that we're being influenced or farmed or something like that, right? Even Clark too, right?
Yeah. I've noticed there's Clark especially is very like aware of how the abduction phenomenon works, which I kind of found interesting in hindsight. Because I expected him to be like a staunch scientific realist kind of guy, but I think earlier on in his career he was way more interested in like in Childhood's End, they use a Ouija board, and the aliens are like, well, they're on the right path, but they're not using it correctly, which I find just like an insane thing to add to that novel.
Yeah, it's remarkable. And the head demon looks like a demon, right? There's like weird occult stuff in there. And that's kind of part of the Fortean experience too, is the influence of esotericism and occultism as well, going through a lot of these guys' experiences, right?
Yeah, 100%. So a lot of the writers would have been knowledgeable of Fort. A few took place in Fortean organizations, like Heinlein supposedly did, but I can't find evidence explicitly that he was in the International Fortean Organization. He was at least in Edgar Mitchell's Institute of Noetic Sciences. Dick apparently showed up at a lot of Fortean conferences where he talked to authors, because I can at least find evidence that they talk to each other.
And you talked to his wife, right? His wife said that he mentioned Fort, right?
Tessa Dick kindly answered some questions I had about Philip K. Dick's interest in Fort. And she remembered him telling a story of Fort throwing out all of his notes, which I found that remarkable, because that means not only had he read Fort, but he knew like the history, like his biography. So that illustrates like a pretty insane interest. He's only mentioned by name in one short story, but I think Fort's like blueprints are all over Philip K. Dick.
I think so too. I think he's over Arthur C. Clarke. Like he was a very much, like you say, a very standard scientific intellectual, but his whole mysterious universe is Forteanism, right? It's
Oh, yeah.
secret archaeology and events and things like that.
Yeah,
I grew up on that.
He
Mysterious
sort of
universe.
takes the skeptic position, but I think it's always clear that he's very interested in it, which I think is a fine position to take. Sort of like humoring the idea for a bit. I can respect that more than just like straight up debunking, I guess.
Right. And so, yeah, and there's a lot of, so you go into detail about Clark, Dick, Heinlein, but there's like, we talked about some of this other, there were other guys that kind of were in between Edmund Hamilton and Frank Herbert. Can you talk about some of those early people who corresponded with Fort?
Yeah, so Edmund Hamilton was actually in the earliest Fortean society, corresponded with Fort regularly, and I think that's where the quote about him setting to bring back Moses comes from. But Hamilton also wrote a lot of short stories that explicitly like reference Fortean phenomena. It's clear that he's bouncing off of like the Book of the Damned or Low, and what was I going to say? Eric Frank Russell was actually the head, I believe, the head of the British chapter of the Fortean Society in England. So that I find that interesting too.
And who was William Corliss? He was kind of carried on the work too of Fort, right?
Yeah. So he kind of tried to pick up where Fort left off and sort of just like collating a bunch of like anomalies and journals and things like that. He doesn't have quite the eccentric writing style that Fort does, but I think it's a respectable attempt to continue the work.
And that was
I haven't really mentioned it, but Fort's writing style is just incredibly entertaining. He's almost you can tell he used to be a journalist because he's got that real like flashy early 1900s journalism voice, but he's talking about just the craziest stuff you've ever heard.
Like he almost like it's like stop the press. I've got this story, right? It's almost kind of that urgency. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Very dramatic, but never like super self-serious.
And I mean, this stuff like Corliss, cryptids goes all the way up through Polides, right? Was it Lost 411 or 9/11?
Yeah. I think there's a case to be made that any sort of paranormal nonfiction, almost of any stripe, is like reliant on Fort in some way. It just like kind of didn't exist, and most of the authors of later things are like aware of Fort, are in vague Fortean circles. It's really hard to overstate how important Fort was to this like specific breed of literature.
Right, and that's I think Polides, you can put him in that kind of maybe fiction category because he's talking about real people disappearing, but then there's like, is it Bigfoot? I've talked to Polides, but he's made a whole career off of these disappearances in parks and things like that without, so he's got the same kind of, create the mystery, I think, or leave that mysterious and why did this happen, this paranormal. And I think paranormal is one of the biggest genres of past. After true crime, paranormal is the biggest genre in the modern podcast genre.
Yeah. I would agree with that. I mean, when I remember in the early 2000s, just being like everywhere. And as a kid, I loved that.
Yeah, me too. And I mean, look at Coast to Coast, the popularity of one of the biggest radio shows had all these characters that owe a lot of their kind of approach to Fort. On Daniken, Sitchin, Hancock. Just goes on and on. You mentioned all those names, Lazar, Keel. So really it's a categorical question about whether a lot of these guys are science fiction. And to me, they're all science fiction, but I think they put it out as nonfiction. Would you agree with that?
I think I would agree. I'm trying to think of an example, but like in the case of Lazar, like it is just like I think even let's pretend it's true, right? And he's crafted a great story because I think I'm paraphrasing Phil Patton's Dreamland here, but he knows when to give details and when to not give details to leave just enough like reasonable suspicion that anybody listening to him talk about this is like, well, he may be telling the truth. His details are so precise, but he also doesn't remember specific things, which also seems like very precise. Yeah.
Right. No, and he was on Rogan with Knapp, right? Yeah.
Super cagey about saying it's Bigfoot outright, which I find also a very Fortean trait.
Right. Yeah. Super interesting. I mean, we're in a total Fortean environment. I mean, you talk about the science fiction, but the UFOs are very Fortean. Paranormal is very Fortean. Like, what's causing this? What's behind all this? It just goes through our whole culture. It really goes back through Charles Fort. Who's before him? H.G. Wells, Edgar Allan Poe? I don't know.
And Wells himself was like a pretty strict scientific mind, and particularly hated Fort, apparently, because Theodore Dreiser sent him a copy of one of Fort's books, and he wrote back saying that he threw it in the trash can.
Interesting. I mean, but Fort was not a hit in his lifetime. Is that true, or how was he received while he was alive?
He sort of had a pretty major cult following. I guess the Book of the Damned sold decently well, but I don't think any of the follow-ups did. And he was living off of an inheritance towards the end, I believe. I don't think he was making much in terms of money. But the Fortean Society actually had like some pretty crazy people in it, like Dorothy Parker, Ben Hecht, Alexander Wolcott, just like super respectable New York literati.
Right, the Algonquin Society, right?
Yeah, a lot of overlap between the Fortean Society and the Algonquin Roundtable.
That's right. It's interesting. He's really something else. Like, he was a unique person. Like, he presaged all the stuff that's happening today. Not all of it, but just these genres, these paranormal genres, science fiction, UFOs. And can you talk about Jacques Valet, how he fits into kind of this story?
Yeah, so I think Valet tends to take the Fortean like approach to ufology, in that he's not super interested in the like physical reality of UFOs. He acknowledges that they might be a physical reality, but he's way more interested on the effects of the people that experience them, just sort of as a cultural phenomenon. And I think that Valet is also like super interested in science fiction. He definitely likes to put on the guise of like a globe-trotting ufologist in a way that I think lends itself to like, I mean, again, it kind of feels fictional, but he is really trotting the globe looking for UFO evidence. Yeah.
Right. So he's kind of before, what is it, John Mack, kind of doing that networking. I mean, I think Valet is still around, right? I mean, he's
Yep. I
really
think
living life.
his papers were just put in a special collection at Rice.
Oh,
So I'm trying to think of the name of it, but Dr. Kreipel, I believe, is in charge of it.
interesting.
It's
And
the
what's the story?
Impossible Archives, maybe?
Say that again.
Impossible Archives?
Possible. Interesting. Interesting. And how does the whole Mothman prophecy, John Keel play into this whole story?
So I know Keel was super into Ford. Ford is mentioned once or twice in the Mothman Prophecies book itself. And I think Keel was also interested in like cataloging anomalies without doing like crazy amounts of due diligence to just sort of craft like a reality around them. Because as for like the prevalence of like Mothman in pop culture now, I can't explain that, but I kind of get it, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. Do you have time for a few questions, Tanner?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. David asks, for the author, are these authors that you've mentioned in the book connected to any agenda?
I think maybe some of them. We were talking a little bit before the show about Valet and Robert Anton Wilson being sort of colleagues, and that there is just kind of a weird milieu around some of these authors. I won't go as far as to say like all of them are, but there's definitely some weird pockets in there where there's something deeper. Because like once you get into Robert Anton Wilson, you get into Discordianism and Operation. Can I curse on here?
Mind F.
Yeah,
Mind Fuck, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That is a real thing. There's no doubt. There's some definite overlap with some of those characters. So there might be an agenda.
Yeah.
Let's see. Michael asks, what story or event caused you to think the most that you came across while writing this book?
Oh man. I guess I'd have to say Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke. I just reading it with like a Fortean idea in the back of my head, I think it's just kind of phenomenal how like many things from folklore, like popular paranormal culture, aliens, it's like all there, and I can't always figure out why it's all there. If that makes sense. I keep having to go back to it and think about it some more.
It's a strange book. I mean, Childhood's End is like the childhood of man is ending and they're going into space, right? They're all becoming morphed into this new civilization. Isn't that right?
Yeah. And I think we've seen that idea pop up a lot in pop culture since then.
And Barbara G asks, wasn't Valet a Christian? He brought up demonology and the UFOs, didn't he? Are you familiar with that?
I can't speak on whether he was a Christian or not. I know that demonology and UFOs get talked about a lot in Passport to Magonia. He's sort of connecting like demon folklore to UFO folklore, but he's also connecting it to like Fae folklore, just like a whole slew of things. In fact, I would say, let me think about this. Since Fort, I think Passport to Magonia is probably the most Fortean work of nonfiction we've gotten since. I may be making too bold of a claim there.
Yeah, you have a Valet quote in your book mentioning Magonia at the intro to one of the chapters, right?
Yeah, and Magonia comes from Fort, or Fort. It comes from folklore, but Fort definitely thought of Magonia as a possibility for why things were falling from the sky.
So that's the other place where it's coming from, or something. It's like a kind of like a heavenly realm or something, right?
Yeah,
right?
I think it's Norse folklore, although I can't speak on that.
And David asks, "Is this a simulation?"
Like that we're in currently, or
I think so. I think you kind of go through that on the book, don't you? Kind of mention that, or one of the authors mentions that.
I do. I think a lot of Fortean authors have picked up on the idea that all the like anomalies around us are sort of like a matrix type construction where the system messes up for a second. I personally don't think we're in a simulation, but I don't know. That's a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, we could do a whole show on that.
I think I'm skeptical of the way that's been pushed in pop culture.
Well, Tanner, we are at the 37-minute mark. Is there anything you'd like to add or anything I missed? Can you talk a little bit about where people can get the book as well?
Yeah, so you can find it on mcfarlandandco.com. It's also on Amazon. There's a link to it on my Twitter page, which is at Tanner F. Boyle 1.
Gotcha. At Tanner F. Boyle. So is that also a good place for people to reach out to you if they have any future questions or anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm currently focusing on UFO incidents as psychological operations, military operations. So that if you're interested in that, I've put a few threads together. I hope they're decent.
Nice. What was that movie that they had where there was like a military intel guy? It was a documentary. Was it Magic Men or what was it called? Shoot.
Oh, Mirage Men.
Mirage Men. Yes, thank you. That was really good.
Highly recommended watching.
Yeah, that's really important. I also did Spies, Kooks, Saucers, Spies, and Kooks with, that's a really good one that goes into that as well. Written by somebody who's a member of the Discordian Society, which, something. Anyway, great interview, really informative. Loved reading through the book. I mean, it just really opens up to how influential this Fortean current environment is to modern cultures, particularly science fiction, like you cover, but in different mediums as well, not just books. I mean, that's kind of what you get away with. At least that's what I took away from it. So, Tanner F. Boyle, title of the book again is The Fortean Influence on Science Fiction, Charles Fort and the Evolution of the Genre. And the author again is Tanner F. Boyle. Thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks again for having me on. This was really fun.
Cool. Awesome. Stay there.